Sarah Morrow had never thought she'd end up here, working the night shift in a drafty, deserted warehouse, surrounded by crates marked with nothing but cold, cryptic symbols. She was desperate. After losing her job as a waitress, Sarah had found herself standing in line at the food bank far too many times. Her son, Danny, deserved better. So, when Vince Arnett, the smooth-talking manager with an easy smile, had offered her the night security job, she grabbed it without a second thought. It wasn't glamorous. The job paid in cash, and Vince had been oddly specific about her duties. Nothing complicated, he'd said, his grin not quite reaching his eyes. Check the cameras, patrol every hour, make sure the door stays locked. Do what we ask, and you'll get a nice bonus at the end of the week. He'd slipped her the keys and a worn notebook, promising that all she had to do was follow the list. Sarah had clung to that promise, focusing on each routine task, hoping to ease the pressure on her mounting bills. But the warehouse had its secrets. She'd feel eyes on her when there was no one around, catch a light flicker out of the corner of her eye where there shouldn't have been one. Sometimes the whole building would groan, almost as if it was alive, shifting in the dead of night. The first night had been quiet, just her and the notebook. She made the rounds, marked the times, and did her best to ignore the uneasy silence of the empty aisles stacked with crates taller than she was. The tasks were strange. Label some boxes, mark others as processed, and move a few to designated spots. Her fingers worked through them like clockwork. It was money, she reminded herself, all to keep Danny in school and to pay for his medicine. But on the third night, the tasks changed. The note Vince had left was different. He wanted her to move a few crates into a side room she'd never opened before. The keys felt heavy in her hand, but she unlocked the door without question. The side room was empty except for a steel grate in the floor and a cold draft that made her shiver. She moved the crates like he'd asked, sealing the room back up, telling herself it was just a warehouse. Just things, nothing more. But she started to notice more strange requests. A camera that needed adjusting so it pointed to a blank wall, lights that should stay off when she patrolled a certain corner. And then there were the locked crates she wasn't supposed to look at. Vince had been very clear about that. They had numbers scrawled in thick red ink across them, and every time she walked past, she swore she could hear something shifting inside. Sarah tried to ignore her fear. She tried not to think about how Vince's smile always looked a little sharper each night, or why the notebook now listed times in such precise detail, times she couldn't make sense of, times that made her feel like she was more of a participant than just a guard. And then, it all unraveled. The sixth night was when she heard the voices, men, arguing in the dark corners of the warehouse, their shadows dancing under the flickering fluorescence. She crept closer, staying in the shadows herself. She heard snippets, words like police, get rid of it, and her name. Her heart began pounding as she realized Vince wasn't helping her at all. He had been leading her by the hand, step by careful step, into a trap. Sarah raced back to the office, her mind scrambling for an escape. The notebook was still there, pages filled with her neat handwriting, detailing every task she'd completed, every single thing she'd done, every crate she'd moved. Evidence. The word flashed in her mind, blinding her with panic. She realized she was the perfect scapegoat. Everything she'd done, every crate she'd moved, every camera she'd adjusted, it was all set up to make her look like the mastermind of whatever scheme was going on here. Sarah grabbed her phone. She had to call someone, anyone, to get her out. But before she could dial, she heard Vince's voice behind her. "You weren't supposed to find out," he said, a tone of disappointment tinged with a cold, calculated edge. Her hands shook as she turned to face him. Vince was no longer smiling. Behind him, two men loomed, their expressions empty, their intentions all too clear. "You should have just done the job, Sarah." Sarah bolted, shoving past Vince and the others, sprinting down the dim aisles. She had to get out, had to find Danny. She could hear the men chasing her, their footsteps echoing off the concrete, closer and closer. The main door was in sight, freedom just a few yards away, but then she felt a hand grab her shoulder, yanking her back, her scream muffled by Vince's grip. The door flew open, but it wasn't her salvation. It was the police. Flashlights blinded her, and she was shoved to the ground. She heard Vince's voice, smooth and cold, explaining how he'd caught the thief, how she'd been moving stolen goods for weeks. Sarah tried to scream her innocence, but all she could see was the officer picking up the notebook, her handwriting staring back at her. She could hear Danny's laugh in her head, the sound of his voice asking if she'd be home soon. Tears blurred her vision as the handcuffs clicked into place. It didn't matter what she said. She'd walked right into the trap, and now she was about to lose everything she had fought so hard to protect. As the police escorted Sarah out, Vince met her gaze one last time, that crooked smile returning. "Some people are just meant to take the fall," he whispered. And just like that, she was pushed into the back of the squad car, the weight of betrayal and hopelessness pressing down on her chest. Story 2. The day Dan and Lisa Turner moved into 126 Sycamore Lane, the weather was perfect. The sky a brilliant blue, dotted with soft, fluffy clouds. The neighborhood was almost eerily picturesque, lined with identical white fences, manicured lawns, and welcoming neighbors. It seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start, a chance for Dan and Lisa to leave behind the cracks in their marriage and build something new. They first met Edwin Harper on the afternoon they moved in, while unpacking boxes in the driveway. Edwin, their next-door neighbor, appeared at the edge of their property, carrying a freshly baked apple pie. He was older, late 60s maybe, with a warm smile and kind eyes. He wore a neatly pressed shirt tucked into khakis, his appearance as tidy as his immaculate lawn. "Welcome to Sycamore Lane," he greeted them, holding the pie out with both hands. Lisa smiled warmly, while Dan hesitated for just a beat, the kind of instinctual pause that comes from years working in IT, where Dan had learned to distrust too-good-to-be-true gestures, but they were trying to be better, to trust each other and the world around them again, and so they invited Edwin inside for a coffee. Edwin seemed harmless, talkative, polite, and a little lonely. He spoke fondly of his late wife, Margaret, and reminisced about the old days when the neighborhood was full of children. He even offered to help Dan and Lisa settle in, telling them to come by any time if they needed anything at all. Before leaving, he shared his phone number, scrawled neatly on a yellow sticky note, and Dan pinned it on the fridge. The next few weeks felt almost idyllic. Dan and Lisa enjoyed quiet evenings in their new home. Lisa took photographs of the landscape nearby, while Dan set up his home office. They were getting back on track, or so it seemed. They even shared small laughs about Edwin's frequent visits. He always seemed to be around, offering gardening tips or just waving from his yard. It wasn't until a month after moving in that Lisa first noticed something odd. She was going through her camera roll, editing pictures she'd taken in the backyard, when she found an image she didn't remember taking. It was of her and Dan in the living room, sitting close on the couch sharing an intimate moment. It wasn't a photo she'd taken. It was as though the camera had clicked on its own. "Dan, come look at this," she called, her voice tinged with confusion. Dan frowned, staring at the photo. "Did the camera just go off by itself?" Lisa shook her head, unease creeping up her spine. They both tried to laugh it off. Maybe the camera timer had somehow activated, but the doubt lingered. Then other things started happening. Dan would notice the back door slightly ajar when he was certain he'd locked it. Lisa found her studio lights turned on at strange hours, even though she hadn't touched them. They began feeling eyes on them, the hairs on their necks rising for no apparent reason. Their perfect home started to feel like a stage. One night, as Dan was working late, he decided to test a new firewall configuration. Out of habit, he ran a network scan to see which devices were connected to their Wi-Fi. He expected to see the usual, his laptop, Lisa's phone, maybe their smart speaker. But there was something else, an unfamiliar IP address with a strange label, cam feed. His stomach dropped. "Lisa," he called, his voice cracking. She rushed into his office, and together they searched the house. They found the first hidden camera behind a vent in the living room, then another, tucked into a clock on the kitchen wall. Panic set in as they moved from room to room, discovering that nearly every space in their home had been violated. Their bedroom, the bathroom, even Lisa's studio. The next morning, Dan and Lisa went straight to Edwin's house. They pounded on the door until it swung open. Edwin stood there, that same warm smile on his face, as if he'd been expecting them. "Oh, Dan, Lisa, come in," he said, stepping aside as if this were a casual visit. "I've just put on some tea." Lisa's voice trembled with rage. "You sick bastard! You've been spying on us?" Edwin sighed as though they'd disappointed him somehow. Now. It's not what you think. It's for your safety. I've kept an eye out, made sure everything's all right. You should be grateful, really." Dan's hands clenched into fists. "You're insane. We're calling the police." Edwin didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled that same practiced smile and gestured to a neat stack of papers on his coffee table. "You might want to reconsider," he said softly. "I've got all the necessary documents. You signed them when you moved in. Standard neighborhood paperwork, nothing out of the ordinary. I've got your permission to keep my cameras up. It's all quite legal, you see." Dan and Lisa exchanged a horrified glance. They remembered the paperwork. Pages upon pages of lease agreements, neighborhood rules, privacy waivers. They'd been so eager to start fresh, they hadn't read every line. The police came, but there was nothing they could do. Edwin had covered every base. The documents had their signatures, and Edwin had the law on his side. He smiled at them from his porch, as the officers explained how difficult it would be to pursue any action. His eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of a man who knew he'd won. Dan and Lisa were left standing in their front yard, feeling the walls close in on them. Their perfect home had become a prison, each room a reminder of how easily they'd been deceived. They had moved here for a fresh start, but now they were trapped in a nightmare of Edwin's making, their lives no longer their own. And from his window, Edwin watched them, a cup of tea in his hand, his smile never fading. Story 3. Dr. Miles Warren had always prided himself on control. In the sterile, high-stakes environment of an operating room, he wielded absolute power, guiding scalpels, repositioning aneurysms, conquering the fragility of the human body. But now, in the suffocating stillness of room 312, he had become the body, a fragile, unmoving figure confined to a hospital bed, his mind screaming inside an unresponsive shell. Miles had been a brilliant surgeon, but a stroke had turned his existence into an inescapable prison. He could hear, see, think, but not move a muscle, not so much as blink to communicate. Locked-in syndrome, they called it. He spent his days staring at the ceiling, visitors coming and going, unaware of the torment within. Occasionally, his ex-wife, Carol, would visit, more out of a sense of duty than love. She'd sit beside him, tears barely suppressed, reading from books he used to love or updates about their son. He would give anything to reach out, to hold her hand, to apologize for the years spent buried in his career. But all he could do was lie still, his mind howling in silent anguish. The days blurred together, one seamless stretch of monotony broken only by the fluttering activity of hospital staff. And Nancy Jacobs. She was the head nurse, her heels clicking with authority as she strode into his room. She had a practiced kindness, her smile almost touching her eyes. She'd check his vitals, speak to him in soft, reassuring tones, adjusting the blinds to keep the harsh sunlight from glaring into his eyes. It would have been comforting if Miles hadn't known what she truly was. The realization came slowly. With nothing but time, Miles found himself piecing together every sound, every whispered conversation in the dim hours of night, when Nancy assumed no one was listening. At first, it was the small things. A wallet slipping into her pocket when an elderly patient passed, medication doses not quite matching what the doctors had prescribed, whispers about fixing the records. She spoke in clipped, low tones to the other nurses, commanding in her certainty, her orders laden with implications. "Make sure he's sedated. The family won't know any better," Nancy had muttered one night. Miles's pulse monitor gave a tiny beep, the only betrayal of his rising anxiety, as he realized she was talking about Mr. Dunham in room 305. The next morning, Dunham was gone, his bed remade, his name erased from the board at the nurse's station. Days turned into weeks, and Miles bore silent witness to the machinations of Nancy's network. He heard about patients who knew too much, who had threatened lawsuits, who had asked the wrong questions. He watched her falsify records, discard vials, whisper threats, all under the guise of caring for those most vulnerable. And each day, Miles's rage grew. He had been an architect of life-saving miracles, and now, in his broken body, he was helpless while lives were snuffed out around him. One night, the worst of his fears was confirmed. Nancy entered his room, accompanied by an unfamiliar nurse. "This one, Dr. Warren," Nancy said, her tone cold, all pretense of compassion dropped. "The family's still holding out hope, but honestly, keeping him here is costing us. Let's start cutting down his oxygen. Let nature take its course." Miles felt a shudder run through his mind, a mental scream that no one would hear. He was a body they could erase, just another asset to manage, another bed to free up. The following day, the staff reduced his ventilator support, Nancy's orders carried out with ruthless efficiency. Miles watched the room begin to blur at the edges as his lungs labored for air. He thought of Carol, of his son, of the apologies he'd never make. His vision dimmed, and he felt his consciousness slipping away, the ceiling above dissolving into darkness. Just as everything began to fade, Nancy's voice cut through the static, her tone clipped, indifferent. "Another one gone. Just the cost of doing business," she muttered, as if she was reading a grocery list. Miles's last thought was not of himself, but of the countless other patients left to her mercy, victims whose stories would end just like his, in silence and shadow. Story 4. Mark Anderson always knew this day would come. He had planned for years, down to the last detail, waiting patiently for the right moment. The group of old friends was excited about the reunion, a hiking trip in the mountains that would remind them of simpler times. For Olivia Chen, it was another chance to pull her old friends together, to remind them why they stayed in touch despite years apart. For Mark, it was a calculated opportunity, a time for long overdue payback. The mountain trail was long and winding, the kind of hike that left legs burning but gave breathtaking views that made everything worth it, at least for those who weren't nursing a festering grudge. Mark kept to the back of the group, his pack sitting comfortably on his shoulders, a small smile playing on his lips as he listened to Olivia. As always, take control. She had that charisma that made everyone listen to her, lean towards her, nod in agreement even when they didn't fully understand what she was saying. "We'll reach the campsite just before sunset," she called out, her voice confident, reassuring. "It'll be perfect. Trust me." Mark did trust her once. He trusted her until that one fateful high school day when she'd made him a joke. One comment, one dismissal, and his life had changed forever. Friends drifted away. Laughter became quieter when he walked by, and he learned to keep to himself. The worst part was, she hadn't even noticed what she'd done. She'd ruined him, and he'd spent years piecing himself back together. But Mark was no longer that humiliated teenager. He was patient, careful. He had a plan, and it began now. The first night at the campsite was idyllic. A warm fire crackled between them. Laughter echoed against the dark silhouettes of pine trees, and stars stretched across the sky like diamonds against velvet. Olivia was at the center, her smile easy, her presence commanding. Mark watched from across the fire, his eyes meeting hers only briefly. He smiled back, but inside, gears were already turning. "Who's got the extra water?" Olivia asked, her eyes scanning the group. "I've got some left," offered Sarah, another friend from their college days, tossing Olivia a bottle. Olivia caught it, giving her a grateful nod. Mark pretended to rummage through his own pack, even though he knew exactly what was in there. He had been slowly siphoning off their supplies, taking just enough that it wouldn't be noticed at first. just enough that the panic would settle in gradually. By the second day, things started to shift. Olivia was still smiling, still confident, but there was a hint of tension in her voice. The group had noticed their water supplies dwindling, snacks missing, a flashlight gone. Olivia tried to keep everyone calm, promising they'd be fine, but Mark could see the cracks forming. "Are you sure you packed everything?" she asked Mark when she noticed he hadn't offered up anything extra. Mark shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "I thought I had, but I guess I messed up," he said, his voice calm, soft, the perfect tone to make him look harmless. Olivia frowned, but didn't say more. She didn't need to. The others had already noticed her frustration, the way she seemed to be holding them all together by sheer force of will. Mark knew the doubts had begun. The third night was colder. The wind howled through the mountains, and the group huddled closer to the fire. Mark had quietly hidden Olivia's gloves earlier in the day, watching her look for them in confusion before giving up. He watched as her hands shook from the cold, her smile fading as she wrapped her arms around herself. "We're running low on food," Eric said, his voice edged with anxiety. "How is that even possible?" Olivia tried to reassure them, but Mark spoke before she could, his voice filled with concern. "Maybe we should check the packs again. Make sure nothing's missing." He paused, his eyes meeting Olivia's. "I mean, it's easy to overlook things when you're in charge of everything." The seed was planted. The others looked at Olivia, doubt flickering in their eyes. She laughed it off, but Mark could see her confidence slipping. He could see her wondering if maybe, somehow, this was her fault. By the fourth day, the group was fractured. Whispers spread as they trudged along the narrow mountain path. Olivia's decisions were questioned, her leadership resented. Mark nudged the growing mistrust with carefully chosen words, expressions of worry that seemed genuine. He pointed out that Olivia was the one who organized the trip, the one who insisted they'd be fine, the one who still had food when others ran out. He watched as his words took root, as his friends started to look at Olivia with suspicion, as if she was hiding something from them. "I don't know what's going on," Olivia said, her voice cracking as she looked at the group. "But you have to trust me. I'm not hiding anything." "How do we know that?" Mark asked quietly. "How do we know you're not just trying to save yourself?" That was all it took. The group turned on her, anger and fear driving them to lash out. They accused her of lying, of hoarding, of leading them into danger without a plan. Olivia's protests fell on deaf ears. Mark watched as they stripped her of her pack, as they left her behind, her eyes wide with shock, her breath coming in short gasps. He stood there, watching as they walked away, leaving Olivia alone in the growing cold. She called after them, her voice desperate, but no one looked back. Mark felt a strange calm wash over him, a sense of fulfillment he had imagined for years. By the time the group realized their mistake, it was too late. They returned to find her lifeless, her body curled against the unforgiving cold of the mountain. The realization hit them like a blow. The horror that they had done this, that they had abandoned their friend, that they had been played. Mark stood apart from them, his expression unreadable. He watched as they fell apart, as the weight of what they had done shattered them, turning friends into strangers, united only by the terrible thing they had done. Mark knew he had won. He had taken everything from Olivia, just as she had once taken everything from him. And as the group descended the mountain, broken and distrustful of each other, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Story 5. David Monroe hadn't planned to come back to his grandparents' house. He'd avoided the place for years, convincing himself that life was too busy, that his job as a high school history teacher was too demanding, that his divorce took all his energy. But when his grandparents passed, something about the finality of it all called to him, a whisper from the past that insisted he return and face his family's history. It was a gloomy Saturday morning when David drove up to the old Monroe house, a squat, unassuming building on the edge of town. The driveway was cracked, weeds crawling through, and the wooden front porch sagged. He stood for a moment, breathing in the smell of wet leaves and decaying wood, the memories of his childhood visits rushing back in waves, his father's stern voice, the muffled arguments that carried through the walls, the sense that something was always just slightly off. The day passed slowly as David began sorting through his grandparents' things, peeling back the layers of their life, yellowed letters, old photographs of stiffly smiling relatives, and newspaper clippings from decades past. The afternoon grew dim, the sun beginning to slip behind the hills, when David found a door he'd never noticed before. It was set into the wall of the cellar, almost hidden behind stacks of dusty boxes. Something about it sent a shiver down his spine. He pushed aside the boxes and knelt before the door. It was small, barely more than a crawl space, with a rusted iron latch that resisted his first pull. He paused, his heart pounding. What could be in there? He thought of all the things he'd already found, his father's old journals, the pictures of distant family. But something about this door felt different, more secretive, like it wasn't meant to be found. With a final tug, the latch gave way, and the door creaked open, releasing a puff of stale, musty air. David clicked on his flashlight and aimed it inside. The beam revealed a narrow set of steps leading downward into a small room beneath the cellar. He hesitated, then climbed down, his shoes echoing softly in the tight space. The room at the bottom was dark and cold, the air damp and sour. As David moved the light across the walls, he felt his breath catch in his throat. There were drawings, childlike sketches scrawled directly onto the concrete, figures holding hands, a crude house, a dog. He took a step forward, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand as he swept it across the room. In the corner, he saw a small bed, its metal frame rusted, the mattress thin and stained. A chill ran through him as he noticed the restraints, frayed leather straps attached to the bedposts. David swallowed, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His father, Arthur, had always been distant, cold, a man who ruled their household with an iron will. But this was something beyond sternness. This was cruelty. His gaze caught on a pile of worn children's books stacked beside the bed. He picked one up, his fingers brushing against the yellowed pages, and noticed a name written on the inside cover. Thomas. He blinked, the name unfamiliar, yet somehow ringing with a distant echo. Who was Thomas? David's heart pounded harder as he sifted through the pile, uncovering more drawings, small toys, and a diary. It was filled with shaky handwriting, the entries scattered and disjointed, words like quiet, cold, bad, repeated over and over. David felt his stomach twist, a deep unease settling in his bones. The realization hit him slowly, like a dawning horror. Thomas, a forgotten sibling, a brother no one had ever mentioned, hidden away because of something, because of a condition. David's mind reeled, memories resurfacing. The muffled sobs he'd heard as a child, the excuses his father made to keep him out of the basement, the sense that something dark lay beneath the surface of their family. He felt his knees weaken, the walls of the room closing in on him as he imagined a child, his brother, trapped here, alone, hidden away like a secret shame. David climbed back up to the cellar, gasping for air as though he had been underwater. He staggered into the kitchen, his mind spinning. How could Arthur have done this? How could he have lived with himself, pretending that Thomas didn't exist? David thought of his own children, the way he sometimes caught himself barking orders at them, feeling that familiar tightness in his chest, that need for control. He closed his eyes, a wave of nausea washing over him. Was he just like Arthur? Was this darkness part of him too? He sat down heavily at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the dusty wallpaper, his thoughts tangled and chaotic. The weight of his family's history pressed down on him, the secrets and lies, the cruelty that had been passed from one generation to the next. He had come here searching for answers, hoping to reconnect with his roots. But now all he felt was a deep, aching sense of loss. For the brother he never knew, for the family he thought he understood, for the person he feared he might become. The next morning, David packed his things and left the house. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let the past repeat itself. He had to break the cycle, to be better than his father, to be the kind of parent his children needed, the kind who would never lock away his love, never let his fear turn into cruelty. As he drove away, the house grew smaller in his rearview mirror, fading into the distance. David took a deep breath, the weight in his chest lifting slightly. The road ahead was long, uncertain, but at least he was moving forward, away from the darkness, towards something better.